Welcome to the Beau Show. I'm focusing today's show on the lethal drug fentanyl. Because when we keep using the term pandemic, we obviously think of COVID through preconditioning. But falling under the radar is the opioid pandemic, a pandemic within the pandemic. And a lot of that can specifically be linked to the drug fentanyl. What would have been a normal Wednesday night in Southold, New York, part of Suffolk County, 911 calls began to come in recently. A string of about 8 people in Long Island's North Fork had overdosed on cocaine laced with fentanyl, all under the age of 40, and 6 of them were dead. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that can be 50 times more potent than heroin and 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. Here's a great visual of a lethal dose of heroin versus a lethal dose of fentanyl. It's just a few specks that can kill. While overdoses are common in Suffolk County and in America as a whole, the new wrinkle is this fentanyl lacing. While fentanyl used to be mixed in with heroin, its new cocktail with cocaine is creating a lethal combination. According to an article in the New York Times, this is an emerging trend as drug dealers have to handle the same supply chain issues that every other company has had to face, which has driven prices up. This means that some dealers have turned to fentanyl, which is both cheap and abundant, to keep their volumes flowing, even at the expense of human life. And in addition to the supply side reasons for dealers turning to the deadly drug, the pandemic has also provided a demand, as the impact of the pandemic has caused many to turn to drugs as a fix. So you have another lethal combo: low supply, which causes dealers to turn to a cheap alternative, and high demand due to the pandemic's hard-hitting effects on people. This also piggybacks on the larger pandemic of opioid abuse. New York State was able to get $1 billion in settlements from pharmaceutical companies that make opioids. But that's just, of course, from the legal manufacturers. This doesn't touch the recreational street market for drugs, where there's no one to sue. The CDC is showing that in 2020, the highest number ever recorded for overdoses was this past year, 93,000 deaths, which is up 30% from 2019. And the types that are overdosing are not your stereotypical addict. They are everyday people looking for a quick high, or perhaps even first-time users. Chefs, landscapers, jewelry makers, family members of those who overdosed are naturally blaming the dealers for wanting to make money and thus not caring what was in those drugs. And while I would never trivialize the departed, there may not be as much focus on those who seek the high and roll the dice with the product. It is certainly true that, as a whole, Americans have relied on prescription drug makers to numb the pain, so to speak. And those drugs are highly addictive, which is why there are massive settlements in court going on right now. The artist Macklemore has a song with the lyrics, "My drug dealer was a doctor." And that is certainly true. But the street market is different to me because you don't really know what you are getting. I've always had a healthy fear of street drugs because of this very reason. Something that comes in a Ziploc baggie in someone's pocket just seems suspicious to me. They say it's one thing, and it could be entirely another. New York is not only the only place that this is happening. San Francisco and even Nebraska health authorities issued warnings after cocaine users were overdosing on fentanyl. Dr. Chinazo Cunningham, Executive Deputy Commissioner in the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, says that, quote, "People who use cocaine think that the overdose epidemic is not relevant to them. Part of the problem nationally is that the narrative has been around opioids, and what we've seen is that it's not just opioids, it's cocaine," unquote. And that's another thing I want to focus on. Cocaine has been a recreational drug for a very long time, but with the presence and abundance of a cheap alternative like fentanyl, dealers are wise to this and going to cut corners, just like you'd see in any other business. It very well could be the reason that the Surfside condo building collapsed. Bad foundation or architecture that was just a crutch for far too long. So they cut corners. 2 men were arrested for dealing these laced drugs. But that's just 2 less dudes out there wheeling and dealing. As we know about cartels, when one goes down, there are many others ready to fill in the void. It never ends, which is why the war on drugs is just as endless as our war on terrorism. It can never be truly stamped out. Prosecutors are hampered in terms of getting manslaughter charges against these dealers because they have to prove recklessness. And roughly half of states have death by dealer laws that make these homicide charges stick better and give stiffer sentences. Now, the converse of these laws is that it could deter people from calling medics when someone is overdosing for fear of punishment. But then you have guys like Gray Gardner, a senior staff attorney with the Drug Policy Alliance, who think the solution is supplying fentanyl testing kits and Narcan, the drug that can reverse an opioid overdose. It sounds like Mr. Gardner would rather solve the consequence to the overdose than the drug use or source of the drug itself. He has relinquished the responsibility and just committed himself to the solution of last resort. He made this statement, quote, "What we need to be doing is doing a better job as a country, as a society, helping people know when their supply is tainted and having safe places for people to use to prevent overdose," unquote. I find that to be rather obtuse. A better job as a society to help drug users know when their supply is tainted? What about a better job as a society for reducing drug consumption and addiction? How about healthy habits and deterrence to drugs? What about holding dealers in China and Mexico accountable for the production and shipment of fentanyl? And following this string of deaths, all I'm seeing is social groups handing out Narcan and teaching how to administer the drug. That is circumventing the entire problem. That's like making sure you have scissors ready to cut the belt off of someone who is eating themselves to death. Yeah, it works in a pinch, but it's not solving the perpetual habit, which is a daily danger. And let's look at the age of this particular group, all under 40. While we don't know if they were chronic users, I don't imagine this was the first time many of them had tried cocaine. And because it was sourced from the same two dealers, they probably knew them and were regulars. We can blame the dealer for selling a false product, and a lethal one at that. But what do we say about those who were probably regularly snorting cocaine on Long Island or anywhere else for that matter? They are trusting an unvetted, unlicensed person to give them something that could be so powerful that it could kill them. This is not asking a stranger for a stick of gum, a cigarette, or a breath mint. This is playing Russian roulette every time you get your fix. I understand that none of them asked to die, but they took a huge risk for hopefully a huge reward. Some choose to go to their doctors for this fix, and we've seen now that doctors are not so quick to prescribe opioids. But I don't see how you can ever get rid of the recreational street market. The demand is always there. There is always a party in the Hamptons, a club in Miami, a bar in LA. And we are losing the war because we can't keep up with it. Sure, we can strangle Big Pharma for pushing the prescription versions of opioids that are highly, highly addictive but not laced. But in the street world, it's like an alchemist's lab. You just never know what you're getting. April alone of this year saw a 233% spike of fentanyl seizures at the US-Mexico border, according to Customs and Border Protection. 233%. The White House is proposing removing certain penalties associated with fentanyl-related substances, which would remove certain quantity-based mandatory minimums. Biden's Office of National Drug Control Policy has said that this will reduce supply and availability of these drugs, while also protecting civil rights and reducing barriers to research. I can't really fathom why they would want to reduce penalties for fentanyl trafficking, but something about that civil rights mention may be the clue. It's basically allowing the feds to reduce or vacate some sentences, and I don't see how that's a good idea. Senator Tom Cotton agrees with me and pretty much stuck it to Biden as a result of this proposal. It also circumvents the border issue. It also might just encourage illicit Chinese labs to come up with new variants. Where have I heard that word before? Variant. Delta variant. Chinese lab. Makes you wonder. The same drug office under Biden also wants 41 billion for new drug agencies and legislation to counter overdoses. So there we go again. It's all focused on the counter to overdosing rather than the abuse, the addiction, or source itself. Why is no one holding China to account? Why are we permitting a 233% increase of fentanyl across the southern border? Shouldn't we be starting there? Or do we just assume everyone is an addict who can't quit? So we better be just Johnny on the spot with some Narcan. I personally do not feel that the type of proposal that they claim is comprehensive to be comprehensive at all. It circumvents the sources and the smuggling. International Overdose Awareness Day is August 31st, so we are right on the heels of that. Walter Langhammer of Concord, California, is mourning the unexpected death of his 14-year-old daughter, Valentina. Valentina was a freshman at Concord High School, and someone gave her a pill that she was told would make her relax and have sweet dreams. That pill had fentanyl, and Valentina never woke up from her bed. Even in minuscule amounts, fentanyl can kill, and in the case of Valentina Langhammer, she was just a young freshman being told false information. Not everyone is a junkie, and we know this. But there's a black market business where these pills are being sold. Fentanyl is getting laced into just about every single street drug, so nothing is safe anymore. I remember watching a TV show a few years back, I think it was Drugs Inc., about my hometown of Memphis. And drug dealers would lace one of their products with fentanyl so that when that person overdosed, all of the junkies would want to know where he or she got that product, because the presumption is that it's so pure that the person overdosed. It's a business tactic the drug dealer was using so that his brand would be highly desired. It might mean one death, but the business he will get from it outweighs one less junkie. Fentanyl is a synthetic product made in a clandestine lab, so its effects are quite unpredictable. But dealers lace it to enhance a drug's euphoric effects. This differs from the pharmaceutical version of fentanyl, which has been effective for use of pain in cancer patients. Because fentanyl binds so tightly to your receptors in your brain, Narcan is not as effective against fentanyl as it is against heroin. That's yet another reason it is so deadly. I looked up what the street names for fentanyl are. See if you can spot a theme here. Here are the street names: Apache, China Girl, Chinatown, China White, Murder 8, Jackpot, Poison, TNT, Tango and Cash. Anything redundant in there? When I looked at the DEA information about the flow of fentanyl into the United States, they actually had an informative map. Take a look at this. Notice how China gets it directly to the United States, but also to Mexico, which explains the 233% increase in fentanyl seizures at the southern border. The DEA also says this, quote, Mexican TCOs are likely poised to take a larger role in both the production and the supply of fentanyl and fentanyl-containing illicit pills to the United States, especially if China's proposed regulations and enforcement protocols are implemented effectively, unquote. So this means that if China's production begins to lag, Mexico will fill in the void, which again makes our southern border highly vulnerable. Furthermore, because fentanyl is synthetically made, the sources could be anywhere, since it doesn't require the plant-based materials that cocaine and heroin require, which is why those drugs were more geographically sourced. That is a recipe for just unleashing hell on the drug-using population of America. That's going to be one hell of a pandemic. In 2019, Trump was able to get President Xi to crack down a bit on fentanyl by imposing new regulations. But, and this is a key but, how do we trust these regulations? The Brookings Institute said this in a key article about the geopolitics of this. Quote, the following pattern emerges. The government of China at first tends to deny the existence of a problem. Under international or strong domestic pressure, it eventually moves to tighten regulation, but its enforcement tends to be limited and subverted by powerful vested interests of industry representatives, officials of line ministries charged with regulating or promoting the industry, and government officials. Geostrategic interests also trump other considerations, such as enforcement of regulatory compliance, unquote. The Brookings Institute goes on to recommend that the United States monitor all production of fentanyl sourced in China for transparency. Does this sound familiar to you? Remember the Wuhan lab and how unregulated it was? And remember how Fauci was funding it through subgrants with gain-of-function research? See, the monitoring is important because the same facility that might supply us with pharmaceutical fentanyl for cancer patients could also be producing a different variant. And there's that word again. That hits the streets, and the truth is, we just don't know. And then it could wind up in Mexico and travel right across our southern border. I also found an NPR article that profiled a guy in China selling the precursor materials to fentanyl, but refused to unveil him. Kind of ironic considering how media here tends to unmask everyone else it deems worthy of doing so. Michael Lohmuller, a C4ADS analyst, says that, quote, many Chinese networks involved in the production and advertising of fentanyl quickly adapted to increased legal constraints by modifying their techniques to exploit loopholes in chemical restrictions and disguise their activities, unquote. This guy that the NPR article profiles does exactly what I suspected. He works at a pharma company in China by day and ships the materials to make fentanyl to the States or Mexico by night. Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba had dozens of vendors that sold and continue to sell precursor materials even after the ban, according to NPR. So see, it doesn't really matter what Xi does in China because they're going to evolve and adapt like roaches after a nuclear bomb. Some survive and move on. They totally shirk the responsibility too. Here is one vendor's disclaimer. Read this, quote, the customer has the responsibility to guarantee the compound is legal where the receiving address is, unquote. Yeah, I'm sure that's going to happen. Now check out this map that lists the number of production facilities. Ironically, it looks like Wuhan has the second highest number of production facilities. It seems that fentanyl or precursors to it are as easy to get as that dress you ordered from China that's 3 sizes too small and took 2 months to arrive in a beat up cheap plastic bag. You basically have a bunch of Walter Whites all over China making these things and doing it with a little bit of internet startup know-how. In many ways, we are fighting a losing battle because the Chinese technology being used to traffic this stuff is encrypted and sophisticated. And they know this, so that our US agencies can't get into it. So just to recap here, the source of most fentanyl or precursors to it are made in China, often by people working in legit pharmaceutical production facilities. It is shipped to the US or to Mexico rather easily as they encrypt websites and work around laws. Demand is high, and to dealers, something is better than nothing, so they push it, thus giving the buyer something he or she does not know the potency of. It flows across our southern border due to pathetic lax policy. It gets to highbrow places like Long Island, where the coke seeker gets a laced product, and where young children are being persuaded to buy a relaxing pill for $5. We go through a pandemic that is most likely sourced from a Wuhan lab, one the NIH funded, and so it drives demand for drugs even higher, and thus creates more addiction and death. And our current policies desire to reduce sentencing for those who traffic it, and basically an impotent policy towards China, which we know is not transparent. See how this is one big cycle of death? I hope we have all learned something today, because we need to be aware of what's at stake. This is in your state, in your city, in your town. It's in your kids' schools and basketball courts. It's on our streets. If you know someone who has a drug addiction problem, now might be the time to intervene and get them help. Please see the following resources. I'm Beau, and that's the show.